Hello and welcome to Voice of Russia's political debate program, Debating Russia. I'm Peter Lavelle. Washington remains in deadlock with debt default looming. What is this seemingly endless political theater all about? And what does the rest of the world think? And finally, is the U.S. slowly committing economic and financial suicide? To discuss this and more, I'm joined by my guest in London, Peter Oppenheimer. He's an economist at Oxford University. We also have Keith Boyfield. He's a research fellow at the Center for Policy Studies. And here, sitting next to me in Voice of Russia's Moscow studio, is Yaroslav Lisavolok, head economist at Deutsche Bank Russia. If I could go to Yaroslav first in Russia here, right? Let's take a look from the outside in. What do you make of what's going on in Washington here? We've had these problems with the sequester of budgets, and of course what the world is looking at more than anything else is the possible debt default. Give me your thoughts.
Well, from the perspective of Moscow, I would say that precisely at the time when the world economy was hoping to start its recovery and to deal with the vicious circle of slower growth in developed countries leading to slower growth in the developing nations, there was some hope this year that that vicious circle would be reversed and a sort of a virtuous circle would emerge whereby growth in both emerging markets and in developed world would reinforce each other. Instead of that, clearly that risk is probably one of the key risks right now for the global outlook, for global markets. And this is, essentially a major risk that I think leads to problems, potential significant problems, not just for the markets themselves, but for the dynamics of the real sector, for the dynamics of global growth. And the implications can be very severe, as we've seen in 2011. Russia itself can be affected very significantly because it's so susceptible to global developments. So from here, it looks like certainly a major risk factor for the global markets.
Yaroslav, you used the word virtue. And if I can go to Peter Oppenheimer in London, I don't see a lot of virtue in the debate going on in the United States. And I think, Yaroslav brings up a very good point. The Chinese are thinking the same thing. We had a Chinese government official say this week, quote, "It is perhaps a good time for the befuddled world to start considering building a de-Americanized world." Obviously, he's talking about the dollar. Peter Oppenheimer, in a broader sense, I mean, this is irresponsibility. I think we can all agree on that.
Absolutely. I wanted to say, for that reason, in response to Yaroslav, I find it very difficult to take any of this seriously. It's simply irresponsible behavior. This crisis, if that's what it is a kind of polar opposite to a natural disaster like an earthquake or a tsunami or a tornado. It is a wholly artificial, man-made piece of nonsense. Its historical roots are much more interesting, in my opinion, than the current phenomenon. The historical root is the U.S. Constitution. The fact that it has a sharp separation of powers between legislature and executive, and of course judiciary, and by a sort of understandable blunder, the legislature, rather than the executive, has authority over the country's public debt levels. Now, that wouldn't matter if they treated the matter as a bit of a joke and just automatically fell in line with the executive, as happens in one other country I know about, Denmark, where they have a similar thing, but they don't abuse it. They don't take the power seriously. In the United States...
It's not politicized.
It's not politicized. That's right. That's right. In the United States, at certain... not continuously, but at certain isolated moments in its modern history, the legislature has decided to block the intentions and indeed sometimes the past actions of the executive by, I would say, abusing the formal power that it has over the country's debt level. Now, I'll leave it to you to ask the next question.
I was just going to say, I was going to look here, Keith. It's very interesting if we look at the polarization of and I would agree with what Peter just said, this kind of artificial gridlock. And it's very selfish when we look at the global economy, thinking of what Yaroslav just said. But for me, it's more about ideology, and it's two different groups of people. They all want to go to heaven, but nobody wants to die.
I think our
Keith.
current situation reflects a deep skepticism among certain people in America. I read that only in the last week there was an opinion poll in the United States that recorded that 39% of those polled thought that default would have no serious economic consequences. That's quite a striking figure. And I think that in the last few years, you've seen the emergence of the Tea Party and a very, very sceptical view towards public expenditure and a call for limited government. You're seeing seeing that as well in certain places in Western Europe. But it really reflects, as far as I can see, a deep hostility, particularly amongst a certain type of American voting Republican, towards the whole of what LBJ built up in the 1960s, the Great Society. They think it's worthless.
I
Peter,
just
go
want to
ahead.
respond. 39% interesting poll thought a default would have no effect. Shall I tell you something? A default ought to have no effect because it's completely artificial and temporary, and it shows the limitations of financial markets and other markets, that they are, as it were, enthralled to this prospect of a purely formal, temporary, artificial political default and take it seriously as though it were a major economic crisis.
Effectively, they won't pay, but they can pay.
Well, this is the point. In principle, I agree with Keith and Peter here, but there's a different element in play. I mean, it's particularly if you're holding dollars and T-bills outside of the United States, which there are a lot of them, particularly in China. There's a lot here in Russia. But it's not the inability to pay, it's the willingness to pay, the willingness to keep your word, your willingness to be trustworthy. And this is the reason why people have these financial instruments. This is what's at stake here, and I think it's felt very meaningfully around the world. Of course, there are the political games in the United States, and the ceiling will be lifted, but it's the confidence level that's very important.
It's the confidence, exactly. And there's so much that hinges in our economy today and the global economy precisely on confidence, because, again, we're recovering from a major global crisis, right? And the aftershocks are still very much felt. And actually, you could say that this is yet another aftershock of the problems that we've seen develop in the economic system of the developed world. So when the world economy, after the crisis, is so dependent still on the dollar, when a lot of the emerging markets, like Russia, just as Peter said, we have nearly more than 40% of our forex reserves still invested into US dollar denominated assets, that is something that makes the system globally very concerned about what's going on. In terms of confidence, this is a major issue.
Surely one of the implications of this is that you're going to see over the next 12 months a diversification of assets. I think it's come as a wake-up call for some people in China who didn't seem to realize that they held 1.3 trillions worth of US Treasury bills. And I was talking to a very prominent property investor in London yesterday, and there's been a surge of interest in the London property market as opposed to Britain. But in terms of the residential property market and the office property market, you're seeing a huge influx of capital from places like China and Malaysia. For example, the largest Chinese insurance company has just bought Lloyd's, the Richard Rogers iconic building, for the Lloyd's underwriters. And I think you're going to see more and more of that.
Which is a complete disaster, of course. The last thing we want is more foreign money into the London property market.
You're listening to Voice of Russia's political debate program, Debating Russia. I'm Peter Lavelle.
The thing is, when you say quite rightly that people are thinking about diversifying, oh my God, we've got all these cash dollars. Look, that's partly legitimate, but it also reflects a needlessly short-term view. May I give an example from my own personal experience and another part of the forest? In the middle 1990s, in other words, nearly 20 years ago, not quite actually, about 15 years ago, I had a lump of savings to invest, and being a fan of Russia and having friends in the financial markets, I put a substantial chunk for me as a mere, university professor into a Russian debt fund. This was in the mid-1996. Well, now, you know what happened in 1998?
Good idea.
Russia defaulted, and the value of my Russian debt fund, this very substantial for me asset, fell in effect overnight to a nominal sum, but it didn't mean anything because I couldn't sell it anyway. So what did I do? I didn't panic. I shook my head, and I sat back and waited. And of course, Russia sorted its finances out. It held the exchange rate down. It benefited from high oil prices, etc., etc. And in the subsequent, I didn't even need to wait 10 years. It was enough to wait 5 years. I got all my money back and more.
I needed immediately, because
go on.
I was going to point. I got your point. Because I know a number of individuals personally, Americans, British, German, for the age of 45, retired to the south of France just because of what you just said. said, because they knew when to buy, okay, and to wait. Yaroslav, again, this is very interesting because, when we look at the United States, this is, but you say because of the dollar here. I mean, if this was France or Germany or, say, Singapore, this would be good political theater. You'd see a lot of funny cartoons on Facebook. But this is the United States, and this is playing chicken with the world economy, because I think we all agree here that there are certain things that have to be done, but they won't be done for ideological reasons.
Yes.
The Tea Party has been mentioned here. The Tea Party likes to stand up for the small man, the small entrepreneur, but it's actually, they want to stand up for privatization of government for the people that pay for the Tea Party to be able to, I'm talking about the Koch brothers. It's United Citizens with the move in the Supreme Court. It's really all about this. These are ideologues. Ideologues go to vote. Most people don't.
And it's very interesting.
There's a phrase
that,
they use. They want to see the end to business as usual in Washington, D.C. They want to take out whole spending programs.
They got it. They got it.
Because
They got it.
what we're seeing at the moment is a debate between the Republicans and the Democrats as to how to prioritize programs, and the Republicans are wanting to demonstrate something for their intransigence, and they have in their sights President Obama's medical welfare program, and that's why I think it's going to go right up to the line, if not beyond.
For our listeners to understand, what is euphemistically called Obamacare was passed by both houses of representatives, the Senate and the House. It was passed by the Supreme Court. It was signed into law. What we're seeing right now, and using the budget and using the deficit as a political football, God forbid, but they're trying to undo what Obama already accomplished in his first term. This is interesting because what this is ideological warfare, and we're not looking at the average person. There are people that are now on pensions that may not get their pension now. This is very serious, and the ripple effect Yaroslav started out in the beginning of the program is not only felt in the United States, but it's beginning to be felt all around the world.
Yeah, I think in terms of the political debate, when you listen to the political debate in the U.S., you clearly see precisely that the focus really is on the opinion polls. Everything is revolving around the opinion polls, and if there's a change in the opinion polls, that's when actually action is undertaken. It's not the world economy, it's not global issues that are being discussed, that are being taken into consideration. It's really this very narrow focus on what people think about Republicans, whether more people dislike Republicans than Democrats.
And it's always about Obama.
Yeah.
It's always about Obama.
And it's rather shocking to see. It's rather shocking to see how fundamentally parochial and ignorant and small-minded the great American democracy is, totally disregarding global responsibilities when push comes to shove. That is disquieting to see the sort of parochial outlook that underlies it.
Very striking when I go to the United States to see the contrast between going to a city like Boston and New York, where you get quite a lot of information and news coverage about what's going on overseas, and you have the great universities like Harvard, MIT, Columbia. And then when I go to the Midwest in particular, I mean, it's this tremendous insularity, and you're lucky to find out about what's going on in the next state, let alone about what's going on outside the US. And I seem to remember there was a statistic before the Americans had to have a passport to go to Mexico, the Caribbean, or Canada. It was said that 90% of all Americans don't actually have a passport.
Yes, I think that's still a
the
large
only time
percentage.
they used to go anywhere was when they went to Afghanistan or Iraq, courtesy of Uncle Sam.
And they didn't need a passport.
I think it was Jon Stewart on Comedy. Well, it was Jon Stewart that said Americans learn geography through their foreign wars. That's probably true. Yaroslav, let me go back to you here. It's very true about the parochial nature of American politics. And most Americans are very bread and butter people. They think about their job. They think about their family. Most people are not so ideologically driven, not like the elites that are represented in the political establishment. And again, it's really the political establishment that it's fighting itself. But I'd like to bring in one extra thing. You started quite correctly looking back at the crisis of 2008, 2009. It seems to me the same people that brought us to our knees on Wall Street, they're still there. They've already covered themselves. They've leveraged all of this here. And they just fold their arms with no responsibility whatsoever and watch the political theater play out because, well, I mean, if the local school is shut down in the state of Washington, it's not going to affect them. Their children all go to private schools anyway. What I'm getting at is this huge huge disconnect that's going on.
This is something that certainly needs to be taken into account in the policy debate as well, that to some degree I think it is featured in the U.S. policy debate that I heard, that ordinary people are really suffering because of what's going on. And this is, not necessarily what you see with the financial markets, because actually the markets to some degree you can say are almost like turning a blind eye on this. And you can hardly see a decline in the stocks, say, and throughout the past week. If anything, the stock market was growing because they actually think, they look through this. They see that this is political theater and that this is probably going to be resolved at least at some stage. So that actually makes the disconnect and more than what we saw during the previous episode in 2011, when actually the effect on financial markets was far greater. I mean, we were talking about a decline in the stock market of up to 15 to 20%, and everybody was screaming and shouting. This time around, this is actually something that is affecting ordinary people far, far more.
Peter, if I can go back to you in London,
yes,
it seems quite interesting. If we look at the Republicans and particularly the caucus called the Tea Party, it's not hard to get the impression that not only do they do not like Mr. Obama, they don't like his, what we will call colloquially, Obamacare, but they're actually challenging the entire New Deal and Great Society of the last, 70, 80 years. But that's what adds to the kind of tragic comedy of all of this, because if you do poll people in the United States, most Americans like a lot of the social programs that the Great Society and the New Deal brought about.
Of course, because most Americans have a good sense of justice, and they recognize that vast inequalities of income are not only an injustice in themselves, but lead to further injustices like, poor people can't afford proper medical care when they're ill. And it is a defect in the democratic system of the United States that a small caucus can, as it were, hold the nation even for a few days or weeks to ransom in this way. It's certainly important, which I think is what you're implying, to say that this does not represent the true, as it were, face of America, what is going on. It's an aberration and a regrettable one, but it doesn't deprive America of its important virtues.
I'd like to make one observation here, because you're seeing this is a worldwide phenomena where politicians, in order to get elected, you can argue bribe people with their own money and set out a whole range of public expenditure programs in the hope that they'll get into power. And you see this in the Caribbean countries that have got huge debt problems. You see it all across Europe and in this country in particular. And back in 1760, I think it was, George III used to be responsible, this was our monarch, paying the whole of the armed services. We didn't have much of an air force in those days, and also the civil service and the diplomats. And he realised that he couldn't afford to do it from the income from the Crown estates. So they set something up called the Crown Estate, and they promised to pay the dividend from the proceeds of the Crown Estate through to the Treasury. That still goes on today. They paid over £250 million this year. But in turn, the monarch received, as you could argue, a salary from the state. Now, the Tea Party enthusiasts would really like to go back to the days of limited government where the monarch, unfortunately George III lost the US for us, but they would really like to see a situation in which the monarch was personally responsible for the civil service stipends and the army and the diplomats, and then they'd call it quits.
Yeah, but what's wrong is it's not the views of the Tea Party. They can have what crazy views they want. It's the fact that they have but too much leverage by chance, by mischance, over the entire US political system. They have a wholly disproportionate leverage at a moment like this. And one could argue that what one ought to think about is some kind of constitutional amendment. I know that would take years and decades, but a constitutional amendment which would make it impossible for an unrepresentative caucus like this to wreck, even temporarily, the machinery of government.
Well, the Tea Party members of Congress are some of the best paid for campaigns in American history. You're listening to Debating Russia here on Voice of Russia. I'm Peter Lavelle. Peter, if I can go back to you again, one of the things I find quite fascinating, and you kind of touched upon it, is that I think if we look at the history of social welfare programs in the United States and in Europe after the Second World War, they were primarily put into place to create security, the lack of fear, a sense of certainty moving forward. Because I suppose many people in the Tea Party don't know much about history, but, we put in place the welfare state for all of its, warts and shortcomings. but it was put into place for very pragmatic political reasons. We didn't want the rise of communism. We didn't want the return of fascism here. And now we have this, again, a total disconnect in what the state is supposed to do.
Yes, well, that is true. It's not just sort of security and getting rid of fear. It was a greater degree of fairness and diminished differentials in income. And of course, here one, as it were, say America's not alone. There has been a worldwide move towards greater inequality of incomes in very many countries, particularly the older industrial countries of Europe and North America. Now, globally, let's be clear, this is compensated by the tremendous upsurge in incomes in some of the poorest countries of the world, India and China, of course, particularly. But within the old world, inequality has gone up for very bad reasons. It's simply people exploiting the situation and saying they have to do it because of markets. It's all nonsense. It's not just bankers. It is heads of industrial corporations. It is, by the way, vice chancellors of universities. The men
no,
at
you're
the
bringing
top.
up a very good point, Keith. What we are seeing in Washington is political theater, because the corporatization of Western economies, this is really what's in play here, because when you look at the Tea Partiers, they're just helpful idiots. Because, yes, let's get rid of government, but let's let my corporation and my shareholders can do this job so much better than the government. And that's what it's about.
Both
as
in
well.
America and Western Europe, there's increasing hostility as people are paying taxes. There's essentially a focus on who are these claimants for social welfare provisions. And in Britain, for example, you see a lot of worries about so-called immigrants claiming these benefits. Most of the immigrants I know in Britain have all got about 3 jobs. We could do with a few more of them, in my opinion. But I do think that there was a notion after the war in Britain under William Beveridge, former head of the London School of Economics, of the sort of deserving poor. And the whole way in which the Attlee welfare state was created was essentially as they were going to pay unemployment benefit to get people back on their feet, and then they would get back into the labour market. In the last 10 years, while things have become really, really tough, there are an awful lot of people out there, not least from people on relatively low incomes who are paying tax, saying, well, actually, some of the people who are claiming on welfare budgets provided by the state, they're really doing rather too well out of it. And I think that's what we're seeing, a debate in America and Western Europe on that particular issue.
Well, it's very interesting. Yaroslav, if I can go to you, I always look at, when people say dependency on the state and whatnot. Another angle is if you look at the fate of the middle class, or middle classes, how you want to define it, in the United States and in Western Europe, it's crushing debt, and their wages per annum are going down. I mean, and this is a long-term, this is not just since Obama's been president.
To their grandchildren.
And they're transferring wealth to the rich, I would say, at the same time.
Yes.
Okay, Yaroslav, this is one of the things that's very interesting here is that when we watch all of this political circus play out, and there's a derivative part of it with you'd say austerity in Europe as well. But I look at the very pillar, the foundation of the kind of societies that were built after the Second World War, and they were around the middle class. They seem to always be the last people think about.
Yeah, exactly. And certainly a lot of the good things that we've seen coming from the developed nations throughout the past decades was precisely around the growth that was fueled by consumption, the consumerism of the middle class. Now, clearly, we're seeing significant constraints on this, both in Europe and in the U.S., because, quite frankly, for the medium term, for probably a decade or more, we will see that these countries will find it very hard to generate high growth rates, precisely because the middle class is so weak and encumbered with debt. If there is a significant fiscal adjustment, that means that there's less impulse, less capability for the middle class to generate growth. If there's further growth in outlays, we're talking about problems with debt on the other hand. So it's almost like an impossible situation in some regard that is very difficult to resolve. And the other problem that I would also highlight is that we're now focusing on the short-term issues and short-term problems. But one of the key issues is precisely institutional issues, the fact that there's no guarantee that this does not happen again.
Peter, we're slowly running out of time, unfortunately. Is this, when we look at what's going on in Washington right now, is this some kind of tipping point, or is this a slow motion car crash? Because I asked Yaroslav to come on the program because, from the outside looking in, what is the level of patience for the Americans to get their house together, because there are other currencies out there. No currency directly challenges the dollar right now. Not, we can talk about Bitcoin, and that's all kind of interesting to me, but it's no threat, obviously. But I mean, at a certain point, when do the other economies say, look, you just don't have your house together, and we have to move on as a global economy?
I don't see that happening. You see, the people who hold the treasury bills, not cash dollars. Cash dollars are fine. If you've got a suitcase full of banknotes, exactly, no worries. It's government debt that is the issue. And although the Chinese may make angry noises because they now have realized they got 1.3 trillion or whatever it is, there isn't actually much they can do except wait for the United States to sort itself out. And the scandal is, that the United States is sort of playing chicken with its own government debt when it ought to behave like a grown-up.
You can say that we're actually facing a paradox because of the success of the welfare state in both America and Europe. You're seeing people living much older, but they're not part of the working population. You see this very much in France, where the administration is reluctant to extend the retirement age. But actually, the government is responsible for a whole lot of welfare provisions to that retired population. And I think it's unsustainable. In other countries, you're seeing them gradually edge up the retirement age. And I think de facto we're going to see that. There are an awful lot of retired people stacking shelves in supermarkets these days.
I hope very much that Russia reaches the same destination, because at the moment, life expectancy, particularly men, is significantly shorter in Russia than in Western countries.
But it's been
I would like to see my Russian friends living longer.
Well, yeah. Well, this is one of my real pet peeves. When people bring this up, okay, because I watch it very, very carefully. The demographic crisis, quote unquote, that Russia is experiencing. Actually, Russia turned the corner 2008, 2009, and one of the things, and I'm glad I have an opportunity to say this on this program, if you go to any of the major shopping centers in Moscow, there's one floor. If it's 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 floors of this shopping center, there is one floor devoted to maternity. Okay, it's amazing the number of people having children right now. You're right that the life expectancy is dodgy, but it's getting better, and there are children galore. I hope. I mean, one of the things that we have to look at, and I think this is maybe one point we all can mention before we end here, is this whole culture of debt, and this is one thing the emerging market world has really avoided. And Russia, I mean, you can criticize Vladimir Putin for a lot of reasons, but one thing he hates is debt.
Yeah, and I think the fact that we've made the choice throughout the past decade to clean up the balance sheet and prioritize this issue has really served Russia well. I think through 2008, that helped us a lot. I think the last thing that I would say is that the world is looking for models to follow, and certainly what's going on in the U.S. does not make the U.S. economic model a prime example that a lot of the emerging markets will want to follow going forward.
Peter, I'll give you the last word, 20 seconds. Go ahead.
Well, I agree with that last point, but remember, the emerging countries can run huge surpluses, partly because the U.S. is running a huge deficit. So they're still benefiting from what the U.S. is doing.
All right, gentlemen, we've run out of time. We didn't resolve anything, but it was a fascinating conversation. Peter Oppenheimer, Keith Aboyfield, and here, Yaroslav Lisovolik here in Voice of Russia's Moscow studio with me. You've been listening to Debating Russia here on Voice of Russia. I'm Peter Lavelle. Stay with us.